If you're parenting a PDA autistic or high needs child, you've probably found yourself in this position. You know your child needs more support, so you start accommodating. You lower demands, you do more for them, you try to create safety. But then things don't necessarily get easier, at least at first. Sometimes they get more intense. The behaviors get bigger. Then they need even more of you and from you. And you start to feel completely exhausted. And now you're stuck in this push pull. If I don't accommodate, everything falls apart. But if I do, am I ruining their future? At the same time, you're burning out and starting to feel like you're losing yourself in the process. What most parents don't realize is that this experience isn't random. There are actually three things that get triggered when you begin accommodating your child and lowering demands. And if you don't understand these three things, it can feel like accommodation is actually the problem. But when you learn how to work with these three things, especially the fear and the conditioning underneath them, you can start to feel more grounded, more confident, and actually trust yourself in how you support your child without burning out and without losing yourself. And that's what we're going to get into today, because these are the essential things that parents of PDA autistic kids and high needs kids need to work through if you want accommodations and lowering demands to go more smoothly for both yourself and your child. So let's begin. Okay. So when my son first began moving from a more internalized expression of PDA to a more externalized one, it felt like our entire life was turning upside down. Okay, I remember thinking, who is this child? Why is he being like this? This is not the son I knew for so long. So let me be clear here, because he has always been demand avoidant. Okay, so that part wasn't new. So from a very young age, he was demand avoidant and he needed extra support. He also had mild low muscle tone, delays in fine and gross motor skills, and ongoing struggles with eating and sleep and anxiety, okay, that took him over. So I had already learned over time how to accommodate him, okay, in certain ways, like helping him eat, sleeping with him, right, co-sleeping, supporting him with dressing, and meeting him where he was, okay? But then something started to change, okay? What once looked like internal frustration, where he would hold things in or he would just cry when he was overwhelmed, began to come out in more external, more extreme ways, okay? His reactions became bigger and more intense, and what he used to hold inside was now coming out as increased resistance and aggression and a level of dysregulation that was completely different from before. Okay, so my system started to become more overwhelmed then. At school, this behavior was still somewhat contained, but there were signs emerging. We had teachers telling us that they were seeing things in him they'd never seen before. And then at home, it was becoming harder and harder to manage. Okay, and then eventually, everything culminated in him not being able to go to school anymore. Okay, so I found myself scrambling at that point. I was trying to figure out what to do, trying to understand what was happening to my child and what has happened to our life. Okay, now when I learned about PDA, everything clicked. Okay, PDA is pathological demand avoidance, for those of you who may not know it. Everything clicked. Okay, for the first time, I understood that this wasn't about behavior. It was about a nervous system condition that couldn't handle the demands being placed on it and a survival need for more autonomy. Okay, so I knew at that point that I had to accommodate more. I had to take the pressure off, lower demands so that everything could get to a better baseline and he could access skills again. And when I started to do that, I definitely saw that it helped in some ways. Like there were pockets of seeing the improvements, especially around basic needs. Those were the biggest improvements I saw. But then something unexpected also happened. Okay. Things did not get easier necessarily at first. They actually got harder because my son had been holding it together for so long, right? At school, in public, in environments where he didn't feel safe to fully express what was happening inside because he had been masking, he had been suppressing, he had been containing it all, right? Holding it all in. And then when this pressure started to come off, right? He wasn't in school anymore and we were lowering the demands. The pressure started to come off and things started to feel safer. Then all that holding in began to release. So all the fight flight energy that used to stay inside and be more of what is called contained inside a freeze response, right? A clamping down freeze response, it started to come out even more, right? So there was more intensity, more aggression, more dysregulation, and it felt like everything was escalating instead of settling. And I didn't understand it at the time, right? So then it felt like, oh crap, this is not working, right? I've made things worse. Like, what am I doing here? And at the same time, this also wasn't easy for another reason, because everywhere I went, there were reminders, sometimes subtle, sometimes direct, that I was somehow doing it wrong, right? So we'd be at family gatherings, and then I'd get little comments about how I was coddling him and that he would never learn. Meanwhile, I'm co-regulating him, okay? Okay, yeah. Anyways, okay, then professionals, see, I still get a little riled up about that. Okay, then professionals told me not to accommodate things like eating. And I'm like, WTF, right? So they would tell me, like, oh, he could use his own utensils and that he needed to learn. Okay, but then when I tried that, he would just sit there and not eat. And he was already under the growth curve. So what kind of advice is that? And then even at home, okay, there were moments where my husband at the time, and he's worked a lot on his conditioning, God bless him. Um, we've worked on it together, you know, but at the time he would say things like, okay, he needs to get his own snacks instead of barking orders at us. He has to learn, right? And that's expected, right? All of us think that way. Then doctors told me I needed to push more, that he wouldn't learn if I kept accommodating him, right? And that he would just get used to this way of being. And then inside of me, there was this constant push pull, right? This constant push pull, this internal bind, wanting to do this, but then should I do it? No, and then feeling frozen. Because deep down, like I could see that accommodation was what my child needed. Because if I didn't, then his basic needs would go out the window. And at the same time, I was terrified that I was doing it all wrong. Okay. And then as his behaviors became more intense, more aggressive, more volatile, accommodation began to feel like less of a choice and more like something I had to do. Okay. Because if I didn't, there would be hours of rage and destruction and escalation. And I didn't want that. Okay. And then it started to feel like I was trapped, like I had to do this, or my life would become even more unbearable. But there was another layer now on top of this that was building quietly over time. Okay. So this is loaded, my friends. And I know you feel me. I know you feel me. Okay. My son needed so much from me. Okay. More co-regulation, more presence, more attention. There were long stretches where it felt like he needed me almost constantly just to stay regulated. Okay. And slowly I began to feel it in my body. The exhaustion, not just from doing more, but from never really getting a break. Okay, there was very little time for me, very little space for my own needs, even basic things like rest, quiet, taking a moment for myself, bathrooming, eating started to feel hard to access. And underneath that, something even deeper began to surface, a feeling that I didn't have words for at the time, and that was my needs don't matter. It felt like everything had to revolve around what my child needed just so he could function and meet his basic needs. I adjusted I adjusted how I spoke. I adjusted my tone. My language changed. I adjusted what I expected, how I moved through the day. Okay, I served more, I picked up more, I did more, and I did this for years. And over time, it started to feel like I was losing myself. So I lived in this space for years, okay, going back and forth between knowing that this approach was what my child needed and fearing that I was failing him, okay, that I was being too permissive, that he wouldn't learn how to take care of himself, that I was setting him up for a life where he wouldn't be successful. Okay, and because things had gotten harder after I started accommodating, because of that unmasking that he was going through, that release, that intensity, the fear became even louder, right? The thoughts that are always in my head. What if this isn't working? What if I've made things worse? What if I'm doing damage I can't undo? And that's the space that so many parents are living in, okay? Knowing deep down what their child needs now, and at the same time being consumed by fear about what it might mean for their child long term. Okay. So, this is what I see in so many parents. They come to me and they say this over and over again. They know that accommodating their child is the right thing. Okay, they've seen it in real time that the demands of everyday life as they were simply too much for their child's nervous system, that their child wasn't accessing skills, that everyone in the family was stretched, overwhelmed, and barely coping. So they begin to accommodate. Okay, they lower demands, they take pressure off, they try to create more safety, and very often things get harder before they get better. Okay, there's unmasking, there's more expression, there's more intensity, and that's when the fear comes in. Okay, not quietly, but loudly, right? What if I've made things worse? What if this is the wrong path? What if I've just reinforced something that will never change? What if my child never learns the skills they need? And underneath all of that, if this ends badly, it's because of me. Okay, so let's get into, before we get into the three things, okay, and how accommodating affects your own nervous system, I think it's important to name the phase that many kids go through when we begin accommodating them. And this phase often causes a lot of fear that you're making the wrong decision, right? And this phase is called the unmasking phase. Okay, so this is where not a lot of people tell you about this when you begin accommodating, is that there's this unmasking phase for your child. Okay, so when you truly begin to accommodate your child, not just in small ways, but in meaningful and consistent ways of reducing pressure, meeting their nervous system where it is, there's often this phase that feels deeply unsettling because things don't always improve right away. And sometimes instead they intensify. And without understanding why, it's very important to that it's very easy, very easy for you to interpret that as failure, right? So, and then you start to question yourself. So your child, here's the thing, okay? Your child has likely been holding it together for a long time. Yeah, they're having meltdowns with you, but if they're going to school or if they're out in public in any way, they are trying to hold it together, right? So either at school and public environments, where they don't feel safe enough to fully express what's happening inside of them. Okay, so this is called masking, like they've been masking, right? Which is a form of suppressing, containing, holding in their threat responses, right? So their fight or flight responses that get triggered at times, and then like they're holding this in, right? And they're holding in all of their overwhelm. And then when safety increases and masking, when safety increases, what happens is that the masking decreases. Okay, and as masking decreases, the nervous system begins to feel safer to let all the activation that it's been holding, often for years, it feels safer to let it out. Okay, so our kids often have, so this is really important to understand. Our kids, they have a highly sensitive threat system, and they often have chronic stress responses to the world around them, right? So their nervous system is constantly reacting to the world around them, but also the world inside of them and what's happening inside of them. And they just have really sensitive nervous systems. So they can end up holding in a lot of that fight flight activation in automatically. Okay, so anytime we have a stress response followed by an instinct to fight or to flee, and we hold that energy in, then that energy doesn't complete and release from the body. And instead, it stays bound up as this incompleted threat response in the body, okay, which takes a lot of energy to hold in, okay, but because it doesn't have a safe place to move, okay? So when safety overall in the environment and inside increases, then the nervous system doesn't just calm down, it also begins to release that bound stress energy, okay? And that release can look like more aggression, more dysregulation, bigger emotional reactions, more intensity than before. And this can be incredibly confusing, okay? Because from the outside, it looks like things are getting worse. And that thought alone can pull you straight back into fear, okay? But what's often happening here is not regression, okay? It's processing and releasing, right? Because it's safer. So when your child feels safer, the need to mask decreases, the nervous system has more capacity, and that stored survival energy begins to move. And that movement is necessary because what is held in the body needs a pathway out, right? So this is where your role can begin to shift, right? From trying to control this behavior to helping to contain and support it to release. Okay, so this might look like you encourage movement more for them if possible, okay? Or allowing safe expression, right, of the anger or fight flight energy, right? So doing like more aggressive play with them, right? Or supporting supporting that physical discharge through play or other kinds of more aggressive activities, things they enjoy doing that still keeps them in that safe zone but allows them to release that aggression. Or you just stay present with them, you allow what is, right, without yourself shutting without you trying to shut it down. And this phase, okay, while intense, is often temporary when it's supported with understanding and enough capacity. But without that understanding, this is where many parents turn back because it feels like proof that the approach isn't working. Okay, when in reality, it can often be a signal that all the accumulated stress load of the past is being released and they can express more of their impulses now that it's safer. Okay, so I want you to understand this because this makes complete sense from a nervous system perspective that as safety increases, that one's ability to be with and process activation increases as well, okay, for the short term, and that could look really intense, right? But as parents, we need to find ways to support safe releasing of that energy instead of being driven by fear of these reactions, okay? So I wanted to name that first for you before we get into the three things that happen in your nervous system when you begin accommodating and lowering demand. So let's get into that next, okay? So there's three major experiences that always come online for parents when you begin accommodating and lowering demands, okay? And the thing is that if you don't understand these, it's very easy to think that the problem is, the actual accommodations or lowering the demands in itself, but it's not, okay? So number one, the first thing that happens is that there's this double-edged sword of fear, okay? And I call it the double-edged sword because on the one side, there's this kind of fear, and on the other side, there's this other kind of fear. So let's talk about that. Okay, so there's two sides that fear shows up on, right? On the one side, you fear what will happen if you what will happen if you do not accommodate, okay? So the fears are, if I do not accommodate this child, and this child desperately needs it, If I do not accommodate, what will happen? And then on the other side is if I do accommodate, then what will happen? Okay, so that's why it's the double-edged sword. So if I do not accommodate, then I'm fearing that there's going to be more meltdowns, more rage, more escalation, more unpredictability, and then lack of access to their basic needs as well as their skills and abilities. And this is the one that becomes so fear-inducing for us parents. Okay. So you've lived it, right? So your body remembers. Okay. So then we fear it, right? We fear that and we're like, we have to accommodate. But and if I don't accommodate, so you fear not accommodating, right? Then on the other side, it's like, okay, if I do accommodate, then you end up having this fear of how this may affect their future. Okay, so it's like this double-edged sword, right? This bind you're in. And then you start feeling like, well, what if they never learn if I'm accommodating and lowering demands? What if they never learn? What if they never become independent? What if I'm reinforcing something that will make life harder for them? Okay, what if I'm failing as a parent, right? I'm not doing the right thing for them. So no matter what you do, fear is present. Okay. And this creates an internal tension that can feel impossible to resolve. You accommodate, but you're feeling anxious, unsure, even guilty a lot of the time. You don't accommodate, and everything escalates, or your child's basic needs and access to skills go out the window, and you feel overwhelmed, regretful, and like you're failing them. This is a no-win situation in which shame begins to build, okay? Because it can start to feel like, I'm just giving in. This is permissive parenting. I've lost control. And even when what you're doing is actually helping your child in the long run, okay? Okay, so that's the fear that gets triggered, the double-edged sword of fear on both sides that creates this internal bind. Oh, so hard to be with. Okay, the second thing that gets triggered, okay, the second thing that happens, I mean, when you begin accommodating and lowering demands, is that this burnout starts to take hold from your own suppressed fight-flight activation. Okay, so this is one of the least talked about pieces and one of the most important. Okay, so when you begin accommodating and lowering demands, you are often going against your own conditioned survival-based responses. Okay, and you're blocking your own natural fight or flight instincts that will get triggered. Okay, that will get triggered because they do. We all have conditioning and programming, and all of this gets triggered, okay? And then we have these instincts, right, that come up, fight, flight instincts. We have this instinct to correct them, to push them, to say no to them, to enforce, okay? And those all still get triggered, but instead, because you're following this new approach, you hold back, you soften, you adapt, you choose a different response, okay? But you're not always doing it from regulation. And so those original impulses, those fight flight impulses that come up, they don't disappear, they get suppressed, right? They get blocked, they get thwarted. Okay, so your frustration, your anger, your urgency, your need to say no that you overrode, your need to regain control and feel like you have some control that you overrode. Okay, all that fight flight energy stays in your body. And when that energy doesn't have a place to go, it builds and builds and builds. And over time, and also I want to mention, it takes an incredible amount of energy just to hold all of that in. Over time, okay, your system starts to feel tight, activated, on edge, or completely overwhelmed. So think of all the tightening that happens to hold in, okay? And eventually you can't sustain that level of activation anymore. So then your system says, oh, we're burning too much energy. I need to take you to shutdown. And that's a state where you become more exhausted, heavy, maybe even depressed, maybe even full of grief and despair at times. Okay, and this is often burnout. Okay, not just from doing more, but from holding in so much internal activation without release. Okay, so this is why so many parents who are accommodating feel exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't fix. numb or disconnected, right? Easily overwhelmed and like they have nothing left to give. And this is a critical piece because if you don't support your nervous system to let out those fight or flight instincts and accumulated stress load, then accommodation and lowering demands becomes unsustainable. Okay. Okay. So let's get into number three thing, the third thing that happens, okay, when you start accommodating lowering demands. Okay, so this is a deeper emotional layer that often emerges over time. And it's this loss of self and this feeling like my needs don't matter. Okay, so as you accommodate your child, especially when their needs are high, it can begin to feel like everything revolves around them, right? Like you adjust your tone, your words, you adjust your expectations, you let go of a lot of expectations, you adjust the environment, your timing, your energy, you give more, serve more, anticipate more, you hold more for them, likely for years, right? And then slowly it can begin to feel like, where am I in all of this? Okay, there may be very little space left for rest, for quiet, your own needs, and even your own identity, right? Some of you even leave work, right? So you leave something that was for your own, maybe even something you loved, just to revolve your life around helping your child. Okay, and then even your own basic needs can feel hard to meet because your child needs so much of you, right? And they can't handle you leaving their side. And underneath that, a painful belief can begin to form, okay? And that's my needs don't matter. And this can bring up resentment and grief, a lot of grief. Can also bring up disconnection and a sense of losing yourself. And again, without understanding this, it's easy to think that this approach is the problem, right? That accommodating is the problem, but it's not, right? So keep in mind that these three things, okay, the fear that gets triggered, the thwarted or blocked fight or flight instincts that can lead to burnout, and the feeling that your own needs go out the window and you're losing yourself are often what gets triggered when you start accommodating your PDA, autistic, or high needs child. Okay. So now let's understand the deeper roots of what triggers these three things. Okay. So this is a longer podcast for you. So, because I really want you to understand this. Okay. So let's get into the conditioning, right? The deeper conditioning that shapes this fear. Okay. So we're all going to have fear around accommodations because we are all conditioned human beings. Okay. And most of us were raised in systems that taught us that learning happens through structure, repetition, and compliance, right? Success comes from pushing through discomfort. Independence means doing things on your own earlier, right? Like younger and younger. Oh my God, I can't even believe how much I see that. Right? Okay, that there is a right way to develop, right? Okay, this is all conditioning, right? And there is a right timeline to follow. Okay, so this is the conditioning that is in all of us. Okay, and underneath all of that is a core belief that if you don't do things this way, you won't be safe, lovable, you won't belong, and you won't be successful. Okay, so it really comes down to those four things: safe, feeling safe, lovable, belonging, and successful in this world. That's what our conditioning is all about. Okay, they're not just thoughts, they're deeply wired meanings that live in our nervous system and trigger us over and over again. And they are formed through exposure and influence from school systems, right? We learn these in school systems, from family expectations, from cultural norms, and then our own lived experiences or traumas. Okay, and these meanings, okay, the meanings we made throughout our life were often reinforced, right? Meaning driven deeper. That wiring was driven deeper when we were praised for compliance, rewarded for performance, and then disconnected from when we struggled or, weren't following or being in a way that was acceptable to our caregiver or whoever, we were, our caregiver in front of us. Okay. Essentially. Okay. So now when your child cannot follow that path, your brain doesn't just see a difference. Okay. It sees a threat to theirs and your own safety, to your own lovability, to theirs and your own safety, lovability, belonging, and success in this life, because this is what the brain cares about the most. Okay. That's the reality. Okay. So we're going to go a bit deeper into this. Okay. I'm going to give you a lot of examples here on of how we accommodate. Okay. What accommodation actually looks like, and then where the fears show up so that you can really see yourself in this. So we're going to go deeper into how fears and conditioning show up so that you can become aware of what's happening in you, right? Because the first step is awareness. When you can see what's getting triggered inside of you, the thoughts, the meanings, the fears, then you begin to have more clarity, more context, and even more choice. Okay, so instead of fear automatically creating a stress response in your body and driving your reactions, you can begin to work with it and even change it so that, accommodating you can come from a more peaceful and self-trusting way. That's the end goal, right? That we want to get to a place where we can accommodate and lower demands from a more peaceful and self-trusting, honoring yourself and your truth and what you feel like is best for your child. Okay, so much of what I'm about to describe in terms of the ways that we accommodate is also reflected in the work of Casey Ehrlich of At Peace Parents. Okay, and she teaches that these are not permissive parenting strategies, okay, but they're necessary accommodations for a nervous system that experiences demands and loss of autonomy as threat. Okay, so I highly recommend you check out her work if you haven't already. So her work emphasizes lowering threat, increasing safety, and restoring a sense of autonomy so that the child can move out of survival states and into their thinking brain. Okay, there are different kinds of accommodations that we provide to our kids, right? And it's important to understand how each one can activate a different layer of conditioning and fear inside of you. Okay, so let's get into that now. So number one is reducing or removing demands, right? So some of you have heard this term called low demand parenting, or you can think of it as like lowering pressure, right? So what does this look like? So this can look like maybe you're shortening or you're pausing school expectations. Okay, you're letting go of non-essential tasks. Okay, you're pausing their active skill building. Okay, you're pausing that temporarily. Okay, you're removing environments that are overwhelming, right? You're doing things for them even if they have the skill. Okay, you're serving them food when they ask or demand it even. Okay, you're letting go of responsibilities around the house, letting go of eating meals together at specific times, letting go of a consistent sleep schedule, dropping expectations around politeness and proper behavior like please and thank you. Okay, so these are some examples, right, of lowering the demands, reducing or removing demands. Okay, and then what are the fear-based thoughts that can arise? Let's get into that. See if you notice yourself in this, okay? Well, if I let this go now, they'll avoid everything forever. Okay, they won't build discipline. They won't learn how to push through. Okay, don't they need to learn how to push through things sometimes? Okay, they won't learn how to take care of themselves or be responsible. I'm letting them fall behind. Other kids can do this. Why can't mine? Okay, so take a moment to notice here what automatically gets activated in you when you're reducing pressure, lowering demands. Okay. Okay, the second way of accommodating our child could be that we're increasing autonomy and equality. Okay, so we're using like autonomy first strategies and equality accommodation. So This can be like letting your child have more genuine control over what they do, when they do, how they do it, right? So allowing them to feel equal or even in charge in certain moments, right? So you let them win games, you let them go first, or you let them have more, and you're shifting from authority to collaboration, okay, or allowing them to initiate interaction instead of directing them, right? You allow them to initiate. And so the fears that can get triggered here may be things like, oh, they'll never follow rules. They'll only do what they want. I'm losing authority. They're going to think they're in charge. They won't learn limits or boundaries. They'll never choose what's right for them. Okay, so take a moment to see what gets triggered in you. And also notice, okay, how much this feels like truth in your system when in fact it is not truth. It's just a belief that you took on because of how you were raised. Okay, so notice, awareness. Okay, so the third way in which we can accommodate is we provide more flexibility in routines and structure. Okay, so we let go of rigid systems and timelines. So this can include letting go of fixed schedules, adapting to your child's capacity in the moment, okay? So like, for example, changing plans or expectations based on the nervous system load at the moment, okay? So, or allowing variability instead of consistency, okay? Or letting the day unfold based on nervous system state instead of a set of expectations, okay? And then the worry thoughts that can get triggered with this are, well, they need consistency to function. This is too chaotic. I'm creating instability. They won't learn structure. Life doesn't work this way, okay? So just notice what gets triggered in you. Okay, so the fourth way, okay, that the fourth way that we accommodate is co-regulation and increased one-on-one attention. Okay. And this is to provide nervous system safety and more relational regulation, right? So you become like your child borrows your nervous system, right? So this may look like staying physically and emotionally closer to them, right? So you're giving them more undivided attention. You're regulating them at the first sign of distress. Okay, instead of like, oh, let them figure it out, right? So you're being more of that calm, safe presence instead of like just being like, oh, let them figure it out. Okay, you're prioritizing your own regulation so that they can feel safety through you. Okay, and then what's the fear that gets triggered here? Oh, they'll become dependent. Okay, they won't learn to self-regulate. I'm reinforcing this. They're being spoiled. That's a big one. They should be able to handle this on their own. That's another big one, right? Depending on your child's age, you may be thinking that a lot. So notice here what gets triggered in you. Okay, I know a lot of parents feel like this much undivided attention may spoil their child instead of helping them develop a nervous system that feels safer in life. But that simply is not the truth, okay? Our kids have a different developmental timeline and they often need years more of intense co-regulation to help develop their own safety and attachment system to be able to eventually function on their own. Okay. Okay. So number 5 way that we accommodate is that we are adapting the environment and using external regulation supports. Okay. So this is like providing sensory support, novelty, allowing their special interests and allowing screens. Okay. So this may include and look like adjusting the environment to reduce sensory overload, creating safe spaces, using screens as a regulation tool, leaning into special interests deeply, using novelty, dopamine, and sensory experiences to reduce threat. Okay, and then the fear that can get triggered in this, okay, the real world won't adapt to them, right? I'm making them too sensitive, okay, or they won't cope. They'll become dependent on screens for comfort, okay? Or they'll become dependent on comfort. Okay, they need to learn to tolerate discomfort. Okay, this comes up again. So what do you find yourself thinking a lot? Okay, let's bring it into your awareness now so that you can see how your brain automatically judges and reacts because this is such a radically different way to parent, right? So just notice. Okay, and then number 6 way that we can accommodate is lowering pressure in communication. So instead, like we use declarative language, we may use diffusion, we may use humor, may use like not saying anything at all. Okay, so this could include like softening your tone, using indirect or declarative language instead of commands. So I wonder if, I notice, the shoes are by the door, right? Declarative language. And then you're letting go of needing them to respond to you all the time or comply. Okay, you're using humor and silliness or lightness to diffuse tension. You're not correcting or disciplining during survival states. Okay, and then the fear-based thoughts that come up can be, oh, they won't respect expectations. They won't listen. I'm walking on eggshells. This isn't how real life works. Oh, that's a big one. This isn't how real life works. They need to learn to respond when spoken to. So notice what often gets triggered in you when you adjust yourself in ways to help your child's nervous system feel safer. Okay, so awareness first, okay? Notice the automatic thoughts and the fear. Okay, so if you step back, okay, and you look at all of these, you'll start to notice something, that every accommodation touches a belief and every belief activates a fear about the future. Okay, because these accommodations are not just practical changes. Okay, they directly challenge everything that you were taught about discipline, responsibility, independence, success, what it means to be a good parent, what it means to be a successful human. Okay, and this is why this work feels so hard. Okay, not because accommodation is wrong, but because it asks you to question and go against deeply wired meanings about what your brain believes is the right way. Okay, but what your brain believes is the right way is based on old meanings and learnings that don't work for this situation with your child and the life you're living right now. So it's time to let these go. Okay, and yes, that is easier said than done, that's for sure. But when you can let go of these old mental models and meanings of how things should be, then you begin to feel a freedom to follow your true instincts for your child. And that feels freeing and so rewarding too. Okay, so the shift that really changes everything, right, is to first change this question. And the question is not, oh, should I accommodate or not? Okay, that's not the question because we should accommodate. Okay, the question is, can I begin to accommodate from clarity and trust instead of fear? Okay, so take that in for a moment. Can I begin to accommodate from clarity? So I'm very clear that this is the right thing, right? And this is what my child's nervous system needs. And trust in myself that this is the right thing to do instead of fear. Okay, and that shift really changes everything. Okay. Okay, then you got to work with the fear and rewrite the conditioning. So let's get into that next, okay? So understanding the fear is one thing, right? But when it's in your body, when it feels urgent, convincing, and real, it doesn't just go away because you understand your child and what they need, right? The fear gets triggered constantly. So the work is not to eliminate the fear, okay? But it's to learn how to be with it without it taking you over, and to work with it and to work with the conditioning underneath that, right? The conditioning is the deeper thing driving the fear. So freedom lies in not fully buying into the fear as the only truth. Okay? Okay, so step 1, going to give you some steps here, some practical steps here. Okay, so you can sit here and try this as a practice, right? Okay, step one, notice the fear. Okay, first notice it. Okay, we have a tendency to override fear, a lot of us. So the first step is simply becoming aware, pausing and naming what's happening inside of you. Okay, that alone can help your frontal lobe come online. You can say, okay, I'm feeling scared right now. A part of me is feeling scared right now. I'm feeling this fear right now in my body. Okay. So, not noticing that, you know, not necessarily saying that you're failing or you're doing something wrong or making a bad decision. You can notice that too, those thoughts, right? But what's underneath those thoughts is feeling fear. Okay. Scared. Because so often this fear is running in the background, driving your reactions, driving your urgency, driving your doubt without you even realizing it. So it's important to step one, notice the fear. Okay. Then step two is allow the fear. Okay. Allow it to be there so you can build some tolerance to be with it and then support your nervous system with tools. I like using body-based tools to help fear. Okay, so this instinct is always to override the fear, okay, to tell yourself, oh, I shouldn't feel this way, or to push through, or to think your way out of it. Okay, but your nervous system doesn't respond to logic first, it responds to safety at a body level. So instead of pushing the fear away, see if you can allow it. Okay, this helps you to tolerate being with it so that you do not let it take you over and act from it. Okay, so let it be there while you support your body. Allow it, let it be there. I say unblend from it, meaning you are not the fear. You can be the curious observer and the watcher of the fear. Okay, and this is where regulation comes in. And then you bring in these body based tools. Okay, you can do some grounding, right? Grounding is feeling your feet on the floor, coming back to this present moment. You can orient, move your head and neck around, notice something you appreciate in your environment, take it in, helps you come back to the present moment. Breathing. Okay, slow down your breathing with longer exhales. That stimulates the parasympathetic, the rest, relaxation response in the body. Okay, helps your system feel like I'm safe right here, right now. Okay, and then let your body settle just enough so you can come back to the present. Because when your nervous system begins to feel safer, then you gain access to something incredibly important. You can tolerate being with the fear without it taking you over, and you can begin to be able to access clarity and perspective. Okay, clarity and perspective, that's where we want to be. This means your higher thinking brain is more accessible to you now because you can see things differently. Okay, you have options here, you have choice, not just following one way of seeing it, but seeing it in a different way. Okay, so step three is make the fear and belief beneath it explicit. Okay, so what I mean here is that what you're doing is you're gently asking inside, what am I actually afraid will happen if I choose accommodation or lowering demands here? What am I afraid will happen? And so just sit with this for a moment quietly with yourself and just wait for the answer to come to you. Ask inside, what am I afraid will happen if I choose accommodation here? Okay, and then let the real answer come up. Okay, not the surface one, but the deeper one underneath. And it may sound like, okay, they'll never go to school. They'll depend on me forever. They won't have a normal life. They won't be successful. And then the deeper one, beneath all of those, I will have failed them. Okay, so say it clearly, name it, because when the deeper meaning to the fear stays vague, it will have more power over you. But when you bring it into awareness, you can begin to question it and work with it and even change it. Okay. Okay. Then step four, trace it back to the conditioning and the mental model you learned from the past. This is so important. Okay. To gain even more clarity, ask yourself inside then, okay, where did I learn this? Where did I learn this? Where did I learn that this is what success looks like? Where did I learn that this is what makes someone capable? Where did I learn that this is what I needed to do to be safe, loved, accepted, feel like I belong, successful in this world, right? For many of us, this goes back to our own childhood, to school systems, family expectations, cultural norms, to moments where we learned I have to be this way in order to be okay. So it's really important to see, right? To really clearly see how this came from your past. Okay, then step 5, question the learned meaning. Okay, so once you have clarity, once you can see where it came from, now ask yourself, is this learned meaning, belief, and way of seeing things serving me and my child today? Ask yourself that. Is this serving me and my child today? Or is it helping, or is it harming us today by seeing it this way? This is an important step because you need to feel it in your heart, in your system, how much adhering to these beliefs are not working for your family system today. Okay. And a new way of thinking and being is required, as well as a new definition of lovability, of worth, of belonging and success. Okay. You need to create a new definition of that. Okay. So is this helping or is it harming? And most likely you're going to say, this is harming. Okay. So then you're going to sit with that grief. Maybe some grief's going to come up and you may need to process that. Okay. Then step 6, update the meaning. So this is the shift. Okay. So this is where the real shift begins, to gently begin to see this as not truth. Okay. That this is a learned belief and it's a meaning shaped by your past, and to open to something new. Like, what else could be true, right? Ask yourself, what else could be true here? Because the reality is, there are many ways to be safe. There are many ways to be loved. There are many ways to belong. There are many ways to build a meaningful and successful life. The old conditioning does not need to be the one and only truth. Okay. Choose what you want to believe now. Choose what you want to believe now. This doesn't mean forcing yourself to believe something new overnight. It means beginning to orient to a new possibility. Okay, something like, my child can find their own path to a meaningful life, right? And you can add a what if in front of it. My child can find their own path to a meaningful life. Success does not have to look one way. Okay, I can support growth in a way that works for their nervous system. Or there is more than one way to become capable in this world. Okay, or to be capable, right? And then coming back to the present moment. What does my child need right now? Okay, so this is where self-trust begins to build. Okay, not because fear disappears, but because you are no longer letting the fear decide what's true. Okay? Okay. So now we've talked at length about fear. We've talked about working with the conditioning underneath fear, okay, and all the steps to that. And then the other two things that come up are burnout and loss of self, right? So in addition to working with fear, there's the second area to work on is really having outlets to process and release blocked fight flight activations that happen inside of you, okay, due to conditioning and fear that make your system go into burnout more. Okay, so the path here is to work with that activation coming up instead of pushing it down and holding it in and suppressing it in, which just leads to exhaustion and burnout. So I have talked about this at length on other podcasts, so I'm not going to get into the details here. It's really about working with that fight, flight energy and helping it to release from the body. And I teach this in detail in my signature program, the Regulation Rebuild. Okay. Now, then the third thing to work on, okay, is to really work with the wound that gets triggered when you feel like your needs just don't matter anymore, because you are lending so much of your nervous system to your child and their needs, okay? And as we dive into accommodating our child, we often lose our ability to meet our own needs, which triggers a core childhood wound of I don't matter and my needs don't matter. Okay, so it's important to keep in mind that there are two truths to this feeling of my needs don't matter. Number one, it often comes from childhood. And so the work here is to recognize that this wound is compounding the present day feeling. And then there's also the second truth, okay, of how hard it can be to meet your own needs when your child needs so much of you, right? And this is a reality too. And so there can be a lot of grief here to process too. Okay, so it's important to find ways to heal this wound by finding ways to meet your own needs in little ways. Okay, even if you don't have a lot of time to give to yourself, right? Little ways to to meet your needs, and using a lot of self-compassion here. Okay, I also talk about this in other podcasts, so I'm not going to get into the details here. Okay, but let's just talk about redefining success for a moment, okay, before we end this podcast, because a huge part of this work is redefining what success even means. Okay, because the truth is that most of us are operating from a very narrow, conditioned definition of success. Okay, one that says success looks like going to school, learning in a structured, linear way, being compliant, okay, being responsible in specific ways, meeting expectations, and fitting into the system. Okay, and when our child doesn't follow that path, our survival system reacts because it learned that this is the path to being okay. This is the path to being a successful human on this earth. Okay, but part of accommodating your child is being willing to question that and to open yourself to a different possibility that your child's version of success may look very different from yours. And can that be okay? Okay, can you learn to feel safe in a reality that doesn't match the one you were taught? Okay, can you trust that your child can still find meaning, connection, worth, and even happiness in a life that looks different? Because for me, the meaning of success has shifted completely. It's no longer about getting my son to measure up to society's standards or even my own conditioned standards that get triggered. Okay, it's about asking, how can I support him to find his own greatest potential in a way that works for him? Okay, not what I think his greatest potential should be. Find his own greatest potential. How can I support that in a way that works for him? How can I support a life where he feels safer in his body? He understands himself more. He can access his capacities when he's ready. He builds something meaningful in his own way. Okay. And this is bigger than just our children. Okay. I want to name that here. This is how we begin to change generations. This is how we move toward a world where there isn't just one definition of success, okay? Where different nervous system, different ways of being, different paths are not only accepted, but supported, okay? This is huge, meaningful work that we are doing, my friends. I like to call this the work of warriors. And that's what we are in a sense, okay? That is what we are in a sense. I think as parents parenting these kids with these challenges, we are warriors. We are paving the path, okay? And so this is why it's so important to also connect to the deeper meaning of this work, okay? Because this work is not easy. It's not easy. Accommodating your child in this way, it asks a lot of you. Okay. It asks you to question what you were taught, to sit with uncertainty and discomfort, which is so hard, to move through fear, to stay present when things feel hard. And there are moments where it can feel like, why is this so hard? Why do I have to do this? But there is something deeper here, my friends. What if this isn't just something you have to do, but something that holds purpose? What if through this experience, you are being invited to break patterns that have existed for generations, redefine what it means to be successful, create a different kind of relationship with your child and with yourself? Because when you begin to accommodate from a place of understanding, you are not just helping your child function, you are helping them feel seen, accepted, supported, and loved for who they are, not for how well they can meet expectations. And for many of us, that is something we never fully received. Okay, so this work becomes more than just parenting, it becomes healing your own past and probably many generations past too. Okay, it's a way of offering your child something deeper, the experience of being accepted without having to prove anything. Okay, the experience of being accepted without having to prove anything. Okay, and when that happens, accommodations begins to shift from something you feel forced to do to something that you can begin to trust in yourself and even choose. Okay, because you know you are helping your child build a life where they can truly be themselves and be valued and honored for who they truly are. And that, my friends, is a different kind of success. One that, in my opinion, is way more meaningful than any other definition of success I have ever held before. So, my friends, if this spoke to you, if this helped you in any way, please share, please comment. I love to read your comments. And please share with other parents who may need to hear this messaging too. Thank you.